Meu do iri meja memang pacar tak ragu dah. Jujur niat kita tak ada ubah. Sifat-sifat macam ini harus injung dalam muda. Meu do iri meja memang pacar tak ragu dah. Jujur niat kita tak ada ubah. Sifat
Dame un ger.
¿Un qué?
Un ger.
¿Un qué? ¿Un qué?
Un ger.
¿Y si te dijera que tu vida no cambia con grandes decisiones, sino con lo que haces en los primeros 10 minutos de la mañana? No necesitas un nuevo año, ni un nuevo trabajo, ni más motivación. Necesitas un nuevo comienzo, y ese comienzo empieza cada día, justo cuando abres los ojos. Lo que haces apenas despiertas marca el tono de tus pensamientos, tu energía, tu enfoque y, en consecuencia, tus resultados. Hoy vas a descubrir ese pequeño acto que la mayoría ignora, pero que los más disciplinados dominan. Si tienes el coraje de implementarlo, no volverás a ser el mismo. ¿Estás listo para transformar tu vida desde el primer minuto del día? Entonces quédate, porque lo que viene puede cambiarlo todo. Antes de comenzar, quiero que hagas algo poderoso. Ve ahora mismo a los comentarios y escribe esta frase. Hoy elijo cambiar mi vida. Soy estoico. Escríbela con intención, como un compromiso contigo mismo. Porque cuando declaras algo, lo siembras en tu subconsciente y cuando lo repites, lo reprogramas desde dentro. Esta frase no es solo un comentario, es el primer paso hacia tu transformación. Hazlo ahora y hazlo tuyo. Enseñanza 1. Entiende que todos tienen un ritmo diferente para las mañanas. Hay quienes abren los ojos antes que el sol y saltan de la cama con entusiasmo, y hay quienes, apenas despiertan, sienten que arrastran una tonelada invisible. Y no, esto no tiene que ver con pereza o falta de disciplina. Es más profundo, es más humano. Cada persona tiene un reloj interno que marca un ritmo único. Tu energía, tu enfoque, tu claridad mental, incluso tu motivación para empezar el día, no son iguales a las de los demás. Así que deja de compararte, deja de castigarte por no tener esa rutina perfecta que ves en redes sociales. Cuando entiendes que tu biología no es un obstáculo, sino una brújula, puedes construir una mañana a tu medida, no a la medida de las expectativas ajenas. Hay razones científicas que explican por qué algunas personas funcionan mejor por la mañana y otras al caer la tarde. Más de 350 marcadores genéticos determinan si eres madrugador o nocturno. Y eso no lo decides tú, lo decide tu cuerpo. Pero además de eso, hay heridas emocionales que alteran tu ritmo. Dormir mal no siempre es falta de higiene del sueño. A veces es ansiedad, a veces es insomnio emocional, a veces es miedo disfrazado de vigilia. Por eso no sirve forzarte a seguir rutinas ajenas si no parten desde tu realidad interna. Si todos tenemos un mapa biológico y emocional distinto, ¿por qué intentar seguir el mismo camino? Aceptar tu naturaleza es un acto de sabiduría. Aceptar tu ritmo es una forma de respeto. No se trata de resignación, sino de estrategia, porque cuando dejas de luchar contra tu cuerpo, puedes empezar a cooperar con él. No eres menos valioso por necesitar 10 minutos más en la cama. No eres menos disciplinado por no correr a las 5 de la mañana. Tal vez solo necesitas un inicio más lento, más suave, más compasivo. Y eso también es válido. No todas las batallas se ganan corriendo. Algunas se ganan respirando, escuchando lo que tu cuerpo te pide, porque tu energía no viene de forzar el motor, sino de conocerlo profundamente. Crea una rutina que te sirva a ti, no una que se vea bien desde fuera. Tal vez tu mañana ideal empieza con silencio, o con música suave, o con una caminata en lugar de una sesión intensa de ejercicio. Tal vez necesitas escribir antes de hablar con alguien, o simplemente quedarte 5 minutos en la cama sintiendo tu cuerpo. Lo importante no es cómo empieza tu mañana, sino cómo te sientes al vivirla. Si te sientes forzado, no estás avanzando, estás sobreviviendo. Y sí, se puede cambiar, se puede entrenar la mente, se pueden mejorar hábitos, pero desde la comprensión, no desde la culpa, desde la autocompasión, no desde el castigo. El verdadero cambio ocurre cuando dejas de pelear contra ti y empiezas a acompañarte. Cuando entiendes que despertarse no siempre significa saltar. A veces significa simplemente abrir los ojos y no juzgarte. El estoicismo enseña a aceptar lo que no puedes controlar y actuar con virtud frente a ello. También aplica a tu energía matutina. No podemos controlar si amanecemos con más energía o con cansancio, pero sí cómo respondemos a ese estado. Y esa respuesta empieza por no compararte, por honrar tu proceso, por entender que la disciplina no es rigidez, sino constancia adaptativa, que la voluntad no es gritarle al cuerpo, sino aprender a escucharlo. Así que la próxima vez que despiertes y sientas que no puedes seguir el ritmo de los demás, recuerda esto: no tienes que correr una carrera que no es tuya. Tu mañana no tiene que parecerse a la de nadie más, solo tiene que servirte a ti, solo tiene que conectarte con lo que necesitas. Porque una mañana vivida en paz, aunque sea lenta, siempre será más poderosa que una rutina perfecta hecha desde la presión. No se trata de levantarte más temprano, se trata de levantarte más consciente, de dejar de mirar el reloj externo y empezar a escuchar el reloj interno. Y cuando haces eso, descubres que hay un ritmo que sí te pertenece, un ritmo que no depende del juicio de los demás, un ritmo que empieza contigo y que puede transformar todo tu día y todo tu mundo. Enseñanza 2. Respira con conciencia y calma tu mente. Es el primer paso para encontrar equilibrio. Cierra los ojos conmigo. Inhala profundo por la nariz. Deja que el aire se expanda en tu abdomen. Sostén un segundo y exhala lentamente como si soltaras un peso viejo que ya no te pertenece. No necesitas más que tu respiración para regresar al centro. No necesitas más que este instante para ordenar tu mente. Cuando llevas toda tu atención al flujo del aire que entra y sale, la mente se calma, el cuerpo baja revoluciones y tu energía interna se organiza. Es simple, pero no es fácil porque tu mente intentará escapar, recordarte pendientes, abrir bucles, dispersarte. Tu trabajo hoy es uno: volver a la inhalación, volver a la exhalación, volver a ti. Según el estoicismo, gobierna lo que depende de ti, tu atención, tu respiración, tu respuesta. Lo demás es externo. Respira presente, acepta, actúa con virtud y serenidad en cada instante. Siéntate en un lugar tranquilo, con la espalda erguida pero sin rigidez, manos relajadas sobre tus piernas. Cierra los ojos o suaviza la mirada. Lleva la atención al aire que entra fresco y sale levemente tibio. No cuentes, no fuerces, solo observa. Si aparece un pensamiento, no lo pelees. Míralo pasar como una nube y regresa a la sensación del aire en tus fosas nasales, en tu pecho, en tu abdomen. Hazlo durante 10 a 15 minutos. Notarás que al principio tu mente se mueve con ansiedad, como si quisiera resolverlo todo ahora. Déjala. Ella aprende cuando tú persistes, no cuando la controlas a gritos. Respirar con presencia es encender la energía vital que ya está dentro de ti. Cada exhalación es una válvula que libera estrés acumulado, microtensiones musculares y ruido mental. Cada inhalación es un recordatorio de que hay vida, oxígeno, claridad disponible. Empieza el día así y verás cómo la ansiedad pierde volumen, cómo los problemas siguen ahí, pero dejan de aplastarte porque ya no reaccionas automáticamente. Respondes con conciencia, y esa diferencia cambia el tono entero de tu jornada. Puedes sumar un anclaje corporal sencillo. Coloca una mano en el abdomen y siente cómo sube al inhalar y baja al exhalar. Ese gesto entrena a tu sistema nervioso a distinguir entre peligro real y alarma imaginaria. También puedes pronunciar mentalmente entro al inhalar y salgo al exhalar. Palabras mínimas, foco máximo. Cada retorno a la respiración es una repetición que fortalece tu músculo atencional. Así como entrenas el cuerpo con repeticiones físicas, entrenas la mente con repeticiones de regreso a la hora. Habrá días en los que tu respiración esté agitada, superficial, nerviosa. No intentes imponerle paz. Invítala. Alarga un poco la exhalación, como si soplaras por una pajilla invisible. Ese simple ajuste activa tu sistema parasimpático y te ayuda a soltar la tensión. Habrá días en que te cueste incluso sentarte. En esos días, hazlo igual, aunque sea por 3 minutos. La constancia breve es más transformadora que el esfuerzo esporádico y heroico. No busques experiencias místicas ni un estado perfecto de vacío mental. Busca presencia, busca honestidad. Observa cómo un pensamiento llega, ocupa espacio y se va. Observa cómo una emoción aparece, te aprieta el pecho, y si no la alimentas, se disuelve. Observa cómo tu cuerpo, cuando respiras con atención, cambia su tono. Los hombros caen, la mandíbula se relaja, la frente se suaviza. Este escaneo silencioso es higiene mental. Te limpia por dentro sin ruido, sin drama, sin espectáculo. Haz de la respiración tu primer acto consciente del día, antes del teléfono, antes del correo, antes de cualquier decisión importante. Dale a tu sistema nervioso el mensaje claro de que el capitán está despierto. Cuando empiezas desde el centro, todo lo demás se ordena alrededor. Cuando empiezas desde el caos, todo lo demás se vuelve más pesado de lo que realmente es. Al terminar, no te levantes de golpe. Quédate un momento sintiendo el eco del silencio en tu interior. Nota si tu mente está más clara, si tu pecho está más amplio, si tu energía es más estable. Llévate esa estabilidad a tus acciones, hablar, decidir, priorizar, crear. Respira así cada mañana y verás cómo tu ansiedad baja, tu enfoque sube y tu energía deja de desperdiciarse en reacciones impulsivas. La claridad mental no es un accidente, es el resultado de regresar una y otra vez a lo esencial. Y lo esencial hoy es tu respiración. Enseñanza 3. Recibe la luz del sol en la mañana para despertar tu mente y llenar tu cuerpo de energía. Abre la ventana apenas despiertes. Deja que la luz toque tu piel, aunque no tengas ganas, aunque aún sientas el peso del sueño. No es solo un ritual bonito, es ciencia pura al servicio de tu bienestar. Tu cuerpo, tu mente, tu estado de ánimo están profundamente conectados con la luz solar. Cuando permites que esa luz entre en tus ojos, sin lentes, sin filtros, sin pantallas de por medio, le estás diciendo a tu cerebro, es hora de despertar. Y él reacciona con precisión. Aumenta la serotonina, que mejora tu humor, reduce la melatonina, que te mantiene somnoliento, y de forma casi mágica sientes más energía, más foco, más vitalidad. No necesitas sol directo ni que el día esté despejado. Basta con que la claridad del cielo toque tus pupilas. Al hacerlo, tu reloj biológico se reinicia, se sincroniza y le recuerda a cada célula en tu cuerpo que ha comenzado un nuevo ciclo. Lo que logras al exponerte a la luz solar en la mañana no lo consigues con café ni con afirmaciones, porque estás trabajando desde la raíz, desde el núcleo biológico de tu sistema, desde la conexión más directa entre naturaleza y neuroquímica. El estoicismo enseña a actuar con virtud y orden natural, levantarse con el sol, alinearse con el ritmo del universo. Es también una práctica estoica diaria. Hazlo apenas despiertes. Si puedes, sal al exterior, camina un...
Do you ever just look up and wonder, do you ever just look up and wonder,
it's our summer secret, a new day on the horizon, let the sunlight wake us up, feeling good, the anticipation, if there were rules, yeah, we would break them, a feeling no one knows but us. With one breath we're breathing, with one voice we're screaming, we are never leaving. It's our summer secret. It's our summer secret. One breath we're breathing. Lost track of days, feeling like lives, watching a rerun. Ever the same, I'm on the end before it's begun. I've been stuck in life as it stays on, but I've been strong within the fragile lines. Would you break the rules, reach for the sky? Oh, because ignite the dark, I catch a fire without a spark. My walls fall down, now I can see a new beginning waits for me. Begin the night before it's dawn. Awaken me, it's all I want. With heart and hand, you set me free. A new beginning waits for me.
skies in the heaviest of rains. When you just don't see the light, you will find your soul again. Life is just another journey. Fill your heart again with fire, and just keep on going until you will find the flame inside. The flame inside.
I'm tired of always thinking, tired of overthinking, stuck here in rewind. I'm waiting for reaction, waiting for some traction to pull me out in time. I let every tear coming down fall like colorful leaves on the ground. Gravity, no gravity. Can't see any more clouds in the sky. I will never come down from the high. No gravity, oh gravity, won't hold me down, won't hold me down, won't hold me down, won't hold me down. Can't see any more clouds in the sky. I will never come down from the high. No gravity, oh gravity, won't hold me down. Yeah, I was drowning in my sorrow, with no love for tomorrow, no light to guide me back. Up here you'll find me, the solar rays are blinding, and darkness doesn't bind me, that shadow's in my past. I let every tear coming down fall like colorful leaves on the ground. Gravity, no gravity. Can't see any more clouds in the sky. I will never come down from the high. No gravity, oh gravity, won't hold me down, won't hold me down, won't hold me down, won't hold me down.
It was like slow motion. And everything was so out of my control. And in that moment, I don't know what happens where souls go. But I really realized the depth of love that I had. Thank God for music.
You and me are made for the big, big bang. See the spiral in your gaze. We are yin, we are yang.
Embrace the chaos, let's go wild.
I'm out of my head, out of my mind, why? If you let me, I'll be on my dress and into your arms tonight. Yeah, I'm lost without it. stare at each other, 'cause we were always in trouble. And all the cool kids did their own thing. I was on the outside, always looking in. Yeah, I was there, but I wasn't. They never really cared if I wasn't. We all need that someone who gets you like no one else, right where you need it the most. We all need a soul to rely on, a shoulder to cry on, a friend through the highs and the lows. I'm not gonna make it things, no forgiving eyes, looking back at me from the other side, like you understood me, and I'll never let to give me your loyalty, 'cause I'm taking the world, you'll see. They'll be calling me, they'll be calling me royalty. Best to give me your loyalty, 'cause I'm taking the world, you'll see. They'll be calling me, they'll be calling me royalty. Calling me royalty.
Parou,
Todos los días en directo repasamos los tokens que más me interesan a mí y vemos algunos que os interesan a vosotros. Por tanto, o bien compráis lo que os interesa, esa es la primera opción que tenéis ahora mismo, comprar y ya está, y esperar si ya habéis comprado. Y la segunda opción que tenéis es sacar profit de las cosas que están subiendo. Por ejemplo, Morfo no ha subido mucho, pero a lo mejor Morfo cuando se acerque a los $3 puedes sacar profit ahí arriba. Horario de Washington. En Cancún ahora mismo son las 9 y en España deberían ser cerca de las 4 de la tarde. Así que atentos. En Argentina deberían ser las 11 de la mañana. Así que ahora empiezo, ¿vale? A ver. 2 minutos, 1 minuto. ¿Por qué no van a hacer el live stream en su página de la Reserva Federal? ¿En serio? Tenemos que verlo en una página secundaria como Associated Press mismo, no importa. En teoría también tienen aquí la cuenta atrás que empieza en 1 minuto, pero no estoy viendo el stream oficial. Debería estar en la página de la reserva.
Vámonos a ver rápidamente qué está pasando, qué está
risks to employment. The Fed chairman says the inflation outlook is that it will rise, but perhaps at a slower pace. So right now we are looking at a Fed that has the door open for a September 17th cut. And I guess, Lisa, we're probably going to see the long end and the short end reacting here.
Well, let's pull that up right now. You do see an absolute catering in yields on the heels of this opening up to the potential for rate cuts coming out. The downside risks to employment are rising. What you can see also rising. The S&P 500 now up 1.3%. Yields down 8 basis points on the long end for the 10-year, even more for the 2-year.
And looking at the inflation-adjusted yield, the 10-year real yield comes in 6 basis points. That is substantial. It's still within the range, but at 1.86%, it's a real reversal towards a presumption of Fed accommodation.
Yeah, and this comes at a time where there is this question of how they are going to message this, given that inflation has remained above that 2% target since 2021. Mike, do we hear anything about why this is a Fed willing to look through that kind of inflation?
They do anticipate that tariffs are going to add to inflation, and they think it will take place over time, but they're still looking, at least as Chairman Powell puts it, they're still looking at these as one-time price adjustments within each sector. So it's likely that inflation is going to go up, but then they think it stabilizes and might go down again.
Well, right now, let's take a listen to Jay Powell, Chair of the Federal Reserve.
In my remarks today, I will first address the current economic situation and the near-term outlook for monetary policy. I will then turn to the results of our second public review of our monetary policy framework as captured in the revised Statement on Longer-Run Goals and Monetary Policy Strategy that we released today. When I appeared at this podium 1 year ago, the economy was at an inflection point. Our policy rate had stood at 5.25% to 5.5% for more than a year. That restrictive policy stance was appropriate to help bring down inflation and to foster a sustainable balance between aggregate demand and supply. Inflation had moved much closer to our objective, and the labor market had cooled from its formerly overheated state. Upside risks to inflation had diminished, but the unemployment rate had increased by almost a full percentage point, a development that historically has not occurred outside of recessions. Over the subsequent 3 Federal Open Market Committee meetings, we recalibrated our policy stance, setting the stage for the labor market to remain in balance near maximum employment over the past year. This year, the economy has faced new challenges. Significantly higher tariffs across our trading partners are remaking the global trading system. Tighter immigration policy has led to an abrupt slowdown in labor force growth. Over the longer run, changes in tax, spending, and regulatory policies may also have important implications for economic growth and productivity. There is significant uncertainty about where all of these policies will eventually settle and what their lasting effects on the economy will be. Changes in trade and immigration policies are affecting both demand and supply. In this environment, distinguishing cyclical developments from trend or structural developments is difficult. This distinction is critical because monetary policy can work to stabilize cyclical fluctuations, but can do little to alter structural changes. The labor market is a case in point. The July employment report, released earlier this month, showed that payroll job growth slowed to an average pace of only 35,000 per month over the past 3 months, down from 168,000 per month during 2024. This slowdown is much larger than assessed just a month ago, as the earlier figures for May and June were revised down substantially. But it does not appear that the slowdown in job growth has opened up a large margin of slack in the labor market, an outcome we want to avoid. The unemployment rate, while edging up in July, stands at a historically low level of 4.2% and has been broadly stable over the past year. Other indicators of labor market conditions are also little changed or have softened only modestly, including quits, layoffs, the ratio of vacancies to unemployment, and nominal wage growth. Labor supply has softened in line with demand, sharply lowering the break-even rate of job creation needed to hold the unemployment rate constant. Indeed, labor force growth has slowed considerably this year with the sharp fall-off in immigration, and the labor force participation rate has edged down in recent months. Overall, while the labor market appears to be in balance, it is a curious kind of balance that results from a marked slowing in both the supply of and demand for workers. This unusual situation suggests that downside risks to employment are rising. And if those risks materialize, they can do so quickly in the form of sharply higher layoffs and rising unemployment. At the same time, GDP growth has slowed notably in the first half of this year to a pace of 1.2%, roughly half the 2.5% pace in 2024. The decline in growth has largely reflected a slowdown in consumer spending. As with the labor market, some of the slowing in GDP likely reflects slower growth of supply or potential output. Turning to inflation, higher tariffs have begun to push up prices in some categories of goods. Estimates based on the latest available data indicate that total PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in July. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.9%, above their level of a year ago. Within core, prices of goods increased 1.1% over the past 12 months, a notable shift from the modest decline seen over the course of 2024. In contrast, housing services inflation remains on a downward trend, and non-housing services inflation is still running at a level a bit above what has been historically consistent with a 2% inflation. The effects of tariffs on consumer prices are now clearly visible. We expect those effects to accumulate over coming months with high uncertainty about both timing and amounts. The question that matters for monetary policy is whether these price increases are likely to materially raise the risk of an ongoing inflation problem. A reasonable base case is that the effects will be relatively short-lived, a one-time shift in the price level. Of course, one time does not mean all at once. It will continue to take time for tariff increases to work their way through supply chains and distribution networks. Moreover, tariff rates continue to evolve, potentially prolonging the adjustment process. It's also possible, however, that the upward pressure on prices from tariffs could spur a more lasting inflation dynamic, and that is a risk to be assessed and managed. One possibility is that workers who see their real incomes decline because of higher prices demand and get higher wages from employers, setting off adverse wage-price dynamics. Given that the labor market is not particularly tight and faces increasing downside risks, that outcome does not seem likely. Another possibility is that inflation expectations could move up, dragging actual inflation with them. Inflation has been above our target for more than 4 years and remains a prominent concern for households and businesses. Measures of longer-term inflation expectations, however, as reflected in market and survey-based measures, appear to remain well anchored and consistent with our longer-run inflation objective of 2%. Of course, we cannot take the stability of inflation expectations for granted. Come what may, we will not allow a one-time increase in the price level to become an ongoing inflation problem. So, putting the pieces together, what are the implications for monetary policy? In the near term, risks to inflation are tilted to the upside and risks to employment to the downside, a challenging situation. When our goals are in tension like this, our framework calls for us to balance both sides of our dual mandate. Our policy rate is now 100 basis points closer to neutral than it was a year ago, and the stability of the unemployment rate and other labor market measures allows us to proceed carefully as we consider changes to our policy stance. Nonetheless, with policy in restrictive territory, the baseline outlook and the shifting balance of risks may warrant adjusting our policy stance. Monetary policy is not on a preset course. FOMC members will make these decisions based solely on their assessment of the data and its implications for the economic outlook and the balance of risks. We will never deviate from that approach. So, turning then to my second topic. Our monetary policy framework is built on the unchanging foundation of our mandate from Congress to foster maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. We remain fully committed to fulfilling our statutory mandate, and the revisions to our framework will support that mission across a broad range of economic conditions. Our revised statement on longer-run goals and monetary policy strategy, which we refer to as our consensus statement to save time, describes how we pursue our dual mandate goals. It is designed to give the public a clear sense of how we think about monetary policy, and that understanding is important both for transparency and accountability, and for making monetary policy more effective. The changes we made in this review are a natural progression grounded in our ever-evolving understanding of our economy. We continue to build upon the initial consensus statement adopted in 2012 under Chairman Ben Bernanke's leadership. Today's revised statement is the outcome of the second public review of our framework, which we conduct at 5-year intervals. This year's review included 3 elements: Fed Listens events at reserve banks around the country, a flagship research conference, and policymaker discussions and deliberations supported by staff analysis at a series of FOMC meetings. In approaching this year's review, a key objective has been to make sure that our framework is suitable across a broad range of economic conditions. At the same time, the framework needs to evolve with changes in the structure of the economy and our understanding of those changes. The Great Depression presented different challenges from those of the Great Inflation and the Great Moderation, which in turn are different from the ones we face today. At the time of the last review, we were living in a new normal, characterized by the proximity of interest rates to the effective lower bound, or ELB, along with low growth, low inflation, and a very flat Phillips curve, meaning that inflation was not very responsive to slack in the economy. To me, a statistic that captures that era is that our policy rate was stuck at the ELB for 7 long years following the onset of the global financial crisis in late 2008. Many here will recall the sluggish growth and painfully slow recovery of that era. It appeared highly likely that if the economy experienced even a mild downturn, our policy rate would be back at the ELB very quickly, probably for another extended period. Inflation and inflation expectations could then decline in a weak economy, raising real interest rates as nominal rates were pinned near zero. Higher real rates would further weigh on job growth and reinforce the downward pressure on inflation and inflation expectations, triggering an adverse dynamic. The economic conditions that brought the policy rate to the ELB and drove the 2020 framework changes were thought to be rooted in slow-moving global factors that would persist for an extended period. And they might well have done so, if not for the pandemic. The 2020 consensus statement included several features that addressed the ELB-related risks that had become increasingly prominent over the preceding 2 decades. We emphasized the importance of anchored inflation, longer-term inflation expectations to support both our price stability and maximum employment goals. Drawing on an extensive literature on strategies to mitigate risks associated with the ELB, we adopted flexible average inflation targeting, a make-up strategy to ensure that inflation expectations would remain well anchored, even with the ELB constraint. In particular, we said that following periods when inflation had been running persistently above 2%, appropriate monetary policy would likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In the event, rather than low inflation in the ELB, the post-pandemic reopening brought the highest inflation in 40 years to economies around the world. Like most other central banks and private sector analysts, through year-end 2021, we thought that inflation would subside fairly quickly without a sharp tightening in our policy stance, as this slide will show. When it became clear this was not the case, we responded forcefully, raising our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points over 16 months. That action, combined with the unwinding of pandemic supply disruptions, contributed to inflation moving much closer to our target without the painful rise in unemployment that has accompanied previous efforts to counter high inflation. This year's review considered how economic conditions have evolved over the past 5 years. During this period, we saw that the inflation situation can change rapidly in the face of large shocks. In addition, interest rates are now substantially higher than was the case during the era between the global financial crisis and the pandemic. With inflation above target, our policy rate is restrictive, modestly so in my view. We cannot say for certain where rates will settle out over the longer run, but their neutral rate may now be higher than during the 2010s, reflecting changes in productivity, demographics, fiscal policy, and other factors that affect the balance between saving and investment. During the review, we discussed how the 2020 statement's focus on the ELB may have complicated communications about our response to high inflation. We concluded that the emphasis on an overly specific set of economic conditions may have led to some confusion, and as a result, we made several important changes to the consensus statement to reflect that insight. First, we removed language indicating that the ELB was a defining feature of the economic landscape. Instead, we noted that our monetary policy strategy is designed to promote maximum employment and stable prices across a broad range of economic conditions. The difficulty of operating near the ELB remains a potential concern, but it is not our primary focus. The revised statement reiterates that the committee is prepared to use its full range of tools to achieve its maximum employment and price stability goals, particularly if the federal funds rate is constrained by the ELB. Second, we returned to a framework of flexible inflation targeting and eliminated the make-up strategy. As it turned out, the idea of an intentional moderate inflation overshoot had proved irrelevant. There was nothing intentional or moderate about the inflation that arrived a few months after we announced our 2020 changes to the consensus statement, as I acknowledged publicly in 2021. Well-anchored inflation expectations were critical to our success in bringing down inflation without a sharp increase in unemployment. Anchored expectations promote the return of inflation to target when adverse shocks drive inflation higher and limit the risk of deflation when the economy weakens. Further, they allow monetary policy to support maximum employment in economic downturns without compromising price stability. Our revised statement emphasizes our commitment to act forcefully to ensure that longer-term inflation expectations remain well anchored to the benefit of both sides of our dual mandate. It also notes that price stability is essential for a sound and stable economy and supports the well-being of all Americans. This theme came through loud and clear at our Fed Listens events. The past 5 years have been a painful reminder of the hardship that high inflation imposes, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of necessities. Third, our 2020 statement said that we would mitigate shortfalls rather than deviations from maximum employment. The use of shortfalls reflected the insight that our real-time assessments of the natural rate of unemployment, and hence of maximum employment, are highly uncertain. The later years of the post-global financial crisis recovery featured employment running for an extended period above mainstream estimates of its sustainable level, along with inflation running persistently below our 2% target. In the absence of inflationary pressures, it might not be necessary to tighten policy based solely on uncertain real-time estimates of the natural rate of unemployment. We still have that view, but our use of the term shortfalls was not always interpreted as intended, raising communications challenges. In particular, the use of shortfalls was not intended as a commitment to permanently forswear preemption or to ignore labor market tightness. Accordingly, we removed shortfalls from our statement. Instead, the revised document now states more precisely that the committee recognizes that employment may run, at times, above real-time assessments of maximum employment without necessarily creating risks to price stability. Of course, preemptive action would likely be warranted if tightness in the labor market or other factors pose risks to price stability.